This is a Niche Radio podcast. Subscribe to this podcast on iTunes or log into www.nicheradio.co.za.
Welcome to another episode of SuperDads. I'm your host, James Lech, and today we have a very special guest. The professor is in. Professor Frank Barnes from the University of Colorado, Department of Electrical Computer Energy Engineering. Frank Barnes first received his BS from Princeton University in electrical engineering in 1954. His MS engineer and PhD from Stanford University in 1955, 1956, and 1958, respectively. He joined the University of Colorado in 1959. He was appointed a distinguished professor in 1997. He was elected to the National Academy of Engineering in 2001 and received, wait for it, the Gordon Prize in 2004 for his innovations in engineering education from the National Academy. He is a fellow of IEEE. So for those of you who don't know their sort of background, IEEE sort of became the premise for ICNIP. Also, is a fellow of the AAAS and served as Vice President of IEEE for publication and as Chairman of the Electron Device Society and President of the Bioelectromagnetics Society and as U.S. Chair of Commission K International Union of Radio Sciences, also known as the URSI. He and his students have built lasers, flash lamps, superconductors, avalanche photodiodes, and other electron devices. Recently, they have been studying the effects of weak magnetic field on radical concentrations and changes in the growth rate of cancers and other cells. So yes, it does sound like quite a mouthful, and don't worry, we are going to break down some of the more detailed science to simpler terms and narrative examples. But, you know, it's going to be very interesting. It's going to help put a lot of understanding of using physics to explain biology, and that we can learn from Frank's great work, especially from him and his students, in better helping navigate these areas of non-native EMF and sort of where the risks and concerns and how to mitigate them. Frank, thanks so much for being with us here today.
Happy to join you. Hope I can help a little and provide a little information, some of which is not always available.
So for those of you listening on the radio, if you, afterwards, there's going to be a link also to a video recording of this so that there are slides and images and graphics, which will help better illustrate some of the points we're going to discuss. The slides will also be available in the show notes for you to download. So Frank, take it away.
Okay. Well, what I want to do today is, let me get this working the way it should. Is to give you a brief description of some of the theory and experiments that provide a basis for the mechanism of going from the physics through the chemistry to the biology that can lead to health effects for exposures to electric and magnetic fields. Understanding how weak magnetic and radio frequency electromagnetic waves can change the concentration of radicals, reactive oxygen, reactive nitrogen, and which in turn sometimes can cause health effects. Third, I want to outline a model for some feedback and repair process that explains why we see positive, negative, and no change in things like cancer, and why most of the time we don't see much of anything. And then speculate on some of the possible implications of long-term, low-level exposures to weak RF fields. So that's what I kind of look to try to cover this morning in part, and we'll go back through different parts of this at any place that people have questions. So to get started and how to get going on some of this, there's been a debate on possible health effects of radio waves for at least 50 years. And the question is anything going, first questions were raised with respect to radar, and the second question is anything happening if you don't raise the temperature above 1 degree? And that debate, as I say, has gone on for over 50 years. Now, there is another second question that comes along on this is, what's your philosophical approach to setting standards or safety standards? And typical philosophy in the U.S. is to set the standards based on the highest level or the lowest level at which you see damage plus some safety factor on a relatively short-term basis. And that means that you let the science develop, and as science develops, you learn new things over time, and the level at which things prove to be dangerous is expected to grow as your understanding of the science and the biology gets better over time.
So
on the other hand,
interject there, because
sure.
with this background in that, I mean, yes, you've been in this clearly for definitely over those 50 years. I mean, you've been one of the forefathers when this started, back in the day. And with your background being with engineering, that sort of you can share more what got you to personally be more interested in this biological effect, because typically with engineering, there's the focus of how to get the data from point A to B, and that's the core thing, and not really to include this whole biological aspect. So what was sort of the personal realization or tipping point that got you, mediating towards this biological interest?
Well, it started out way back when I was working on lasers. And we wound up, I think, doing the first single cell surgery with lasers. Very hard experiment where you take a ruby laser, put it on one eyepiece of a microscope, you put crosshairs on the other, and you punch the button on the laser and you kill one cell, and you don't destroy the others. Okay. There's target practice. Right? Well, the result of that, I got asked to do various other things. And then the one that really triggered a lot is that I got asked to chair a meeting on the safety effects of radar for the National Science Foundation. And probably a better title for that meeting was I served as referee and tried to keep two people from hitting each other. It was pretty obvious for me that there were some experiments that could be done. And we wound up showing that high power short pulses could rip apart membranes which were well below the safety standards for total energy applied over an hour or over 6 minutes. And so things went from there. Then I got asked to be involved in the second epidemiological study that showed a correlation between the incidence of childhood cancer and proximity to power lines. And to our great surprise, we came out and showed that for relatively weak magnetic fields, the incidence of childhood leukemia for people living close to power lines was roughly 1.5 to 2 times what it was for people who live far away.
So were you also involved in the same sort of time period as Becker and David Becker and Andrew Marino?
Probably before that. And Dave Savitz was the lead on that epidemiological study. Nancy Wertheimer did the first one. I was going to mention that here in a couple slides, but anyway, that's how I got involved in some of this. And I kind of kept one toe, every time I kept one toe in the water, people kept dragging me back to do more work on the biology. I kept rebelling against trying to do it. And finally, a few years ago, I buckled down and decided to put some real time into it.
So why the interest in sort of trying to stay away from as long as possible? Was it because of the politics around it, or because just if you uncover certain more information, sometimes can be quite overwhelming for one to digest and deal with?
No, well, first of all, I never took a course in biology or organic chemistry. And basically, I'm an electrical engineer with a physics background. And the amount of information that one has to sit down and work through just to not do stupid things in biology turns out to be a lot of work. And there are always too many things to do. I was department chairman for a while, and the mean timed interruptions in my office was less than 10 minutes. and served as acting dean, a few other things. So the time to sit down and really learn some chemistry and some biology has been hard to come by. So anyway, that's a little history.
I found also personally, the study, well, like in medicine, is the two branches. There's normally it focuses on the biology and the chemistry or the biochemistry, and typically, medicine or doctors, particularly in the West, don't like to learn physics or apply physics. Where it works, the more Eastern counterparts, Russia and China and Eastern Europe, back in the day, was more standard learning and an application. And personally, I'm not a fan of learning biochemistry. I find it also, as you described, much more challenging because it doesn't necessarily have as those definitive finite things. It's about learning these very complex words and procedures to describe a narrative and story and all these different patterns that always emerge. Where I intuitively enjoy physics a lot more because you have these principles and laws that are much more gravitated. And when you can use those to explain biology, it's a lot more simpler and definable on helping, more categorically predict or understand something. It's just that we're going to come in the series. The difficulty comes in that biology and the effects of the non-native EMF is non-linear versus engineering. It's about focusing on a linear effect.
Well, we got to deal with nonlinear things too, but in any case, it's just a large vocabulary and a very different approach to the way you get at things. And it turns out that trying to develop simple predictive models, you do a lot more in physics and a lot less in biology and medicine. Both biology and medicine are a lot more empirical, pulling together large masses of data. And the experiments are not coupled together theoretically, often, at least in the way they are in, let's say, electrical engineering. So anyway, that's one of the reasons I was slow in finally sitting down and putting the time to try to put these pieces together and tie it back to some work I did on my thesis back on ammonia masers back in 57 and 56. And finally just buckled down and tried to put some of this stuff together. And that's the paper that we have in Bioelectromagnetics, I think, which I sent you, is kind of where I buckled down, and Ben Greenbaum and I worked together on that and tried to get something that provided a bit of a bridge on how you can go from the effect of weak magnetic fields on magnetic dipole moments to change chemical reaction rates, and then then follow up on some of the history of what people know about changes in the concentration of things like hydrogen peroxide due to the biology. And so that's kind of the story today, is the results of trying to pull some of that together, starting at that basis with the physics.
And how many years do you think it took you to sort of the paper that you sent me, we're going to include in the show notes? How long do you think it took you to publish that paper, from desktop, study, learning the process, to having it published?
Oh, well, it took me basically a couple of years to get the theory and stuff together, in one sense, or in maybe 6 months in another sense. But then it took it took a year after you drafted the paper to get it published.
And that's one of the difficulties with science, is that, typically it can take about 20 to 25 years from a desktop study to, reach practical application. And, it also adds into the argument, like you said, the last 50 years, it's all these debates and issues. And, a lot of these studies have been done, but it was not necessarily documented in the way one wants, or it's a language barrier. All this, to get a physicist to talk to a biochemist is challenging. You have to re-merge them with a social scientist and a doctor. It's difficult. Even getting the guys in a room is difficult enough.
Well, let me tell you a funny story on this that happened at the first meeting I was at. A psychologist was describing the effect of microwaves on rats. and she put a water dish and a feeder in a 900 megacycle waveguide, which is roughly a foot by 6 inches or something high. Turned on the power, and the first thing the rat did is run and sit in his water dish. And you should have heard the psychological explanation of that. It was a real beaut. And the engineer sitting in the back of the room said, looked at the rat's tail, says, that dielectric constant for tissue at this area is about 50. That's about 6 inches long. That's about a quarter wavelength. There's a hot spot at the base of the rat's tail. And sure enough, if you look at it with an infrared camera, there was. A smart rat. He sits and it cools his tail in the water dish. But there's no reason in the world that a psychologist should know that. Anyway, that's my favorite story on the difficulty of going across disciplines.
But also, the rat jumping into the water creates a type of Faraday effect as well, so it would help dampen the effects from the emissions.
Oh, sure. But basically, he was cool in the hot spot.
And that's also something that people tend to get confused with, depending on the publisher of the data, because typically when you see the figures of propagation, it's designed or narrated in a free space environment. But in practical application, we have to take into account, as you said, these reflection and also, more importantly, localized hotspots. And Japanese have done a number of very nice studies where the amount of how an inverse square law isn't necessarily applicable, where the amount of radiation absorbed about 20 centimeters away, so that's about maybe close to 8 inches, can be the same as 4.5 meters away.
I've seen that even more dramatically. I chaired a National Research Council study on the PAPAWS radar, and the hill of peaks across the valley from that radar, the exposures were higher than they were up close to the fence.
Yes, yeah. And there's also the issue then when it comes into account with spurious emissions. So if you have a transmitter that's interfering, say, with a radar interfering with an AM transmitter or FM transmitter, and then you have the spurious emissions issue coming about, and that creates more of this erraticness in terms of transients within the wave.
Sure. No, you get you have to pay attention to the details, and data we have shows that the details make a lot of difference. So you got to be careful.
What I found works quite well, because to do these calculations on pen and paper is, it can be a nightmare. So that's why it's most reliable to use software or 3D GIS software that can help calculate these different effects in an environment relatively accurately. So not 100%, but relatively with good accuracy and propagation.
I had some students make a measurement on top of Lookout Mountain. There are over 50 transmitters there for the Denver area. And any of the software models did not begin to show what was really going on. You simply had to go around and make the measurement because of the rocks, the trees, the multiple transmitters, etc. It just, calculations from any of the standard programs weren't even close to what numbers you actually measured.
Okay, that's good to know. And also there's the issue with co-location as well. Typically persons think, if you co-locate a bunch of transmitters in one area, you're going to be safer. However, the thing is with co-location is that it doesn't have a linear progression of more emissions. It actually becomes exponential in terms of the compounding effect.
I don't know. It depends on how things are put together and so forth. The beams may overlap, they may not. Depends on wavelength, so on. So again, the details make a lot of difference. Yeah.
So the main point is planning, and not just in South Africa. We have this term where it's sort of the expression is called a boermaker plan, which means like the farmer will make a plan, and it's just if you want a signal here, just take a hammer and knock it in the wall and put it there, and you have your Wi-Fi signal, and that's it. And then you have the Swiss route, which is, no, we must decide exactly which model. We need to do the whole propagation. We need to do calculations. We need to do measurements. We need to recheck afterwards. Then we know we're putting it in the right place and to avoid issues.
Yeah.
I don't know if you have a similar type of expression in the United States there.
Oh, we got lots of things along that line. So anyway, there is a lot of just detail work that has to be determined on what the exposures are, and then you'll argue people over things are 10, 20% accurate when they don't know the biology to 1,000%. So yeah, there's a lot of contrast there in terms of where you put your effort and determining what's important, that I think hasn't been carried through to the extent that I think it should.
Well, thank you for sharing that history narrative, because now our listeners get to feel a bit more involved and have that personal relationship understanding sort of what can happen. And then you can carry on with the slides now and sort of having everyone understand more the details into the narratives we've been discussing. Okay,
I'll flip through some things here quickly. But one of the points to make is that there's a lot of worry about putting up 5G and so forth. And the question is, if you require that a new technology be proved to be safe, basically you wind up, because there's so many things you haven't thought of, you'd never install it. So you're going to take some risk, and we'll talk towards the end of this interview a little bit about relative risk. But the one thing that people have to recognize is we do not live in a safe world. And and talking about safety may not be the right term. You really want to more realistically talk about relative risk or value received for risk taken. And we'll talk about that more at the end of the talk. All right, just limited current standards in the US, and they're close worldwide, are the exposures to electric field for frequencies less than 368 hertz or 5 kilovolts per meter, and they're set on the basis of inducing the firing of nerve cells. At RF, the exposures are based on heating, and the standards are set at 1 watt per kilogram, averaged over 1 gram in some places, and other standards are set averaged over 10 grams, and that's at 900 megahertz. Numbers are slightly different at 1800 to 2 gigahertz. And the far field exposures are set at 1 milliwatt per square centimeter for 6 minutes in the range from 30 megahertz to 300 megahertz. And again, the numbers are somewhat different at higher and lower frequencies. This is kind of the minimum value. Mostly they're higher. All right. So the current standards do not address the possibility that biological or health effects occur from long-term low-level exposures. And there's good reason for this, because it's difficult to get data that you really believe, because if you look at people, for example, are doing so many different things, they're exposed to many different things, you simply don't have an easy way of understanding how you go from the mechanism through the chemistry, or the physics through the chemistry to the biology to changes that can lead to health effects. This is not easy to do if you're looking at something as complicated as a human and their life pattern over, say, 10 years.
I think staying on that previous slide is that also it's dependent also on which equations one chooses to use to measure these biological effects. So with ICNIP wanting to use the SAR value, it's about that looking at the thermal effect and averaged over time. However, with that equation, and this is what's stipulated by Russia and more important by the Chinese, because ICNIP is approached and says, let's try to create a unified standard for assessment, because it will make the whole process easier. And China stood up, basically, they showed this, and these 3 things that said read between the lines in their narrative, that there's no way they'll change it, because to use SAR, it doesn't allow to cater all the calculations for any of these biological effects. And for that reason, you know, China and Russia decides to rather stick to their equations for measuring the potential biological effects.
Well, the Pacific absorption level, or the SAR, is quite useful if you're talking about heating.
Yeah.
And you can talk about absorption rates. It does not look at the mechanisms to deal with the conservation of momentum associated with changing magnetic field, or changing rate equations associated with magnetic dipoles, as we'll talk about in a little bit. It just doesn't deal with that issue at all. Okay. All right. Well, we've talked, our background on this is that we showed that when we canceled out the Earth's magnetic field, we changed the growth rate of fibrosarcoma cells, HT1080 cells. And this got my attention because that certainly does not deal with the heat problem. Also, notice that some of the toxicology studies wound up showing a decrease in the incidence of cancer for some exposures. And the conclusion was they were not showing an increase, but they basically ignored the fact that they were getting actually a healthy effect from exposure. And that caught my attention. And then we also showed that, Olseman showed, and one of my former students, Carlos Martino, showed that you could increase the growth rate of HT1080 cells by 50% and showed an increase in the hydrogen peroxide concentration. So those were things that caught my attention to start to try to figure out what was going on back earlier. Also,
Dave, sorry, Frank, I seem to interrupt us. We have to take a quick technical break here. The program is giving me some error. I just need to, so we're going to quickly pause here, and we're going to restart the channel chat, and we'll get back into it.
Fine.
And we're back. Sorry for that technical difficulty. My platform we're using here is Zoom. It was just giving an error, something we connect in front, but we're back and we're continuing. Sorry, Frank, for all these interruptions, but please carry on.
Okay, well, anyway, there were measured changes in free radical concentration, and when I really buckled down to this, and also the big interphone study had just been completed. Interphone study, and we'll talk more about it, but I summarized briefly. It showed slightly healthier people for moderate exposure and an increase in incidence of brain tumors for very, very heavy users. And the question is, what's going on here? So anyway, that was some of the background on getting started. Oh, here, I got to get this thing so it's behaving properly. So what we do, the hypothesis I started to work was that we can change concentration of radicals like O2 minus, OH minus, nitrous oxide, hydrogen peroxide, calcium, which are not radicals with magnetic fields. These molecules are both molecules that are used in signaling biological systems, but they can also do damage to proteins, lipids, and DNA. And we need to understand, in some sense, under what conditions they're signaling molecules and under what conditions they cause problems. And secondly, you need to take into account their feedback and repair processes so that most of the time, even if we do things, we don't see anything. We don't see damage. All right, first of all, what's a free radical? It means I have an unpaired electron spin. And I can change its energy by changing the orientation of that dipole moment generated by the electron spin by changing its orientation with respect to the static magnetic field. Radicals are very active. They have a tendency to, molecules have a tendency to wind up with an even number of electrons and the spins paired oppositely, one up, one down, say. All right, the angular momentum for spins.
Let's go back to the previous slide and just simplify things a bit more for our audience members. Because typically, I mean, the average person, they hear about food supplementation. They say, oh, if I'm very stressful environment, I'm going to have these free radicals developing. and I need to buy a specific vitamin or eat certain foods so I can have these antioxidants. But they never really understand what it is or what it means. And what's very key here and nice, great about your diagram and explanation is that it actually comes down to physics of, like I said, it's like a dance partner. You want to have a man and woman dancing together in the symphony and dance. But when you have these sort of stresses or this different music playing versus the waltz and coordination, then you're going to have this unpairing of the electron. And we need to sort of find a new dance partner for the proton or the male so they can have this balance again. Otherwise, we have this issue of a free radical. And, ideally, it's always best that us men are tied down and married versus wandering the fields and the bars and getting into trouble, because then we sort of we have excess hydrogen. And the problem with that excess hydrogen is that sort of, I guess it's us men like gorilla. We beat our chests, and when we get more testosterone, we want to show things. And when we're doing that, we start ending up in fights. And we know in fights, that's batters and bruises, and that's the inflammatory effect within the biology and the human body. So it's always good to sort of have a paired electron or antioxidant to get rid of that testosterone Bruce craziness in us.
Okay, I hadn't thought of it that way, but anyway, if you have unpaired electrons, then you have very active molecules or ions because they want to pair up. So that's, and I thought it's worthwhile to indicate what a radical is. It means I've got an odd number of electrons, an odd number, that means I have a net magnetic dipole moment. We'll go into that in a little more detail coming up.
Yes.
Just a picture here of the magnetic dipole associated with a spinning electron. Mm-hmm. And I've added a slide here. If we take a normal molecule and split it into two parts, we can wind up splitting it such that the electrons are either polarized opposite to each other, which we call the S state, or they can be polarized with the electron dipole moment, magnetic dipole moments polarized in the same direction, which leads to a triplet state because there are 3 energy levels allowed when you put that in a magnetic field. If we go to the next slide, we show how quickly this gets to be quite complicated as you put in a number of electrons into a magnetic field, and you look at what happens to the energy of those as you increase the magnetic field. You wind up with the net energy involved in moving an electron from one orbit to another, either increasing or decreasing as you increase the magnetic field. If these levels cross, you couple the particles in these states together, so you essentially mix the populations in 2 states. If you get to big magnetic fields, you separate them so that these states are not coupled to each other. If you apply an electromagnetic field with a frequency corresponding to the energy to move an electron from one of these energy states to another, you couple the populations in different states together. So this is a little bit complicated to see without a diagram to help you understand it.
So let's simplify some of the wordings here. So D2 is deuterium, correct?
Yes.
Yeah.
And then just pick that as an example because we had a good diagram for it. It's typically many other molecules. So deuterium was just convenient one to illustrate things. In actual fact, if you look at flavins and various other things, the states are likely to be a lot more complicated. And I'll show you in a minute some states for nitrogen.
Well, it's quite good that you actually picked, or it happened to be deuterium in this example, and probably by intuition, because deuterium it's needed in the body, but also when it's in the wrong place at the wrong time, it can create quite a lot of chaos and actually slows down that effectiveness of tunneling. So for those for our audience members, tunneling is where we have the electrons moving and requires a great number of energy and stress. And what you showing in this diagram of the deuterium is that as the magnetic field increases, the distance of the electron and the proton actually shrinks. Correct?
Well, I've got, depending on which state it's in, it either increases or decreases. It can be both, depending on which state it's in. So
what happens in the cell at the quantum level is that by having this greater gravitational pull within the mitochondria, is that it produces or processes and produces water, and the water produces the deuterium depleted, and so the body naturally wants to remove that excess out of it, and that's why having homeostasis at nighttime and a good circadian rhythm is so important and vital, because it helps the body deal with this excess deuterium, because if it just accumulates, it's going to result in more unpaired, more electrons to sort of escape.
I'm not sure. I haven't traced that chemistry. I'm not on top of that. One thing that it does show in this diagram that I have is that has been ignored in a lot of cases is that the nuclear spins also affect the energy levels you're working with. We can go to the next slide. I'll show you more along the lines of what I'm thinking about. On the left-hand side, I have an energy level diagram for one electron spin orbit where it has the angular momentum J3 halves. And you see that is split depending on the projection of that angular momentum on the magnetic field. It's split again with the projection of the nuclear spin, and it's split again, which I don't show, with the quadrupole moment of the nuclear moment of the nitrous oxide. So you can see that even for a very simple molecule like nitrous oxide, if you look at that left-hand side of the diagram, you have a lot of possible energy levels that you can couple together by applying fields that correspond to the energy for transition. Now, all those levels, except the zero levels, wind up spreading, as shown in the previous slide, for deuterium with magnetic field. So I've drawn that for one value or two values of magnetic field, because on the right-hand side, I've said, well, let's assume that we've taken a molecule and we've split it in half. And I'm just using these energy level diagrams as an illustration. And in the top slide, at B0, those energy levels line up, which means that you split that molecule in half and it recombines very rapidly, typically 10 to the minus 10, 10 to the minus 6 seconds. On the other hand, if I change the magnetic field a little, and the two halves or the two radicals have different magnetic dipole, they change differently with the field and they may not line up, so that I have a barrier for recombination, and the lifetime of the radical increases, and it gives it a better chance to drift away and recombine with something else. So by changing the magnetic field, I change the population that can recombine rapidly, and therefore I change the concentration of the radical. This would be true for something like O2 minus combining with something else. All right, the detailed chemistry, I don't think anybody knows at this stage of the game for the reactions that we're interested in as far as the biological health effects go. That's one of the problems that needs to be solved.
Let's go back to slide 10 and just to sort of help cover for the audience to describe a bit more what is angular momentum, sort of what does it mean, and sort of we'll come back to the spin rate and applied magnetic field.
Okay, well, you have two components typically to the magnetic dipole moment. If you look at the far right-hand side of slide 10, you see that it's spinning. So you have one component of angular momentum associated with the spin of the electron. You have another component of the angular momentum associated with the fact that that electron is circulating around the nucleus of the atom or the molecule. So you've got two components. Then, in addition to that, if you apply an external field, you have only discrete allowed projections of that total angular momentum on the external magnetic field. So you have different energies associated because you have discrete allowed magnetic dipole moments that are generated by the spinning electron, both in terms of the spin and in terms of its angular momentum circulating around the nucleus of the molecule.
So let's break it down to the narrative example of a vehicle. All right. So let's say that we're looking at a Porsche engine or Lamborghini, and the tighter the components, or the tighter that spin is. So in biology, it'd be like the respiratory protein within the mitochondria. Is that the tighter it is, that stronger the gravitational pull, the lot more efficient and productive it's going to be. But every time, say, if the car's knocked around or not well serviced, not well maintained, we have more of these gaps coming in, then the distance of the way the respiratory protein is being stretched, even for every 1 angstrom, that the efficacy of the spin cycle reduces by 10-fold. So, having this strong internal magnetic field is a very, very important thing. That links back to your diagram on slide 12 and the effects you're showing on slide 13.
Yeah, well, you can think of the spin on that as one, you've got thing rotating around its own axis. You've got it rotating around some loop where, say, it's driving around a track, it's got an angular momentum. And if it's spinning while it's also going around the track, you've got 2 components to the angular momentum. And then the question is what its projection is on in this case, gravity. So anyway.
So if it's like a NASCAR track and we have all these free radicals that are developing, it's kind of like putting the wrong tires for the wrong day. So if you have going 200 miles an hour around a track, and you've put on normal day tires, and now the rain's coming through and you haven't changed your tires, you're going to be spinning off the road and having this biological dysfunction occurring.
Well, you may or may not, because it turns out we also need these radicals. We use them as a way of communicating signals from one part of a cell to another, or one part of the body to another. So that's where the complexity of some of this comes in, because these things are both required, useful, normal parts of the metabolic process, and also at excess concentrations or outside the right dynamic range cause problems. So you've got both things going on all the time.
And that sort of also then ties into what you mentioned also in one of the papers you sent, which we're going to have in the show notes, is that with the complexity of these biological processes, and again, like I said, there's the feedback mechanisms. So what happens is when the ATP is failing or not working as it should, the AMP kicks in as a backup system. And so if we take that back to the narrative of NASCAR, NASCAR drivers around the track and they're driving for a couple of hours and the weather's changing, you're going to have your drivers that can maintain concentration, they've gone to the pit stop, the feedback mechanism, they've got a good direction how to change things and adapt to the different stresses of the environment. And then you have the other ones that sort of more fatigued, they're not as, they weren't going into the track very well, they're having, maybe some other side issues and the signaling is, happening, problems with that, or like we had technical difficulties early on, and sort of that interrupts the whole process. So if you have a track with 100 drivers, different drivers are going to have different impacts of other systems affecting how that spin rate is going to occur around the track.
Yeah, well, you've got multiple things going on, and it's the complexity of the biological system that makes it difficult to analyze what's happening. Well, anyway, if we skip up to slide 14, I show basically that we have observed data where at 7 to 10 megahertz, we're changing in magnetic fields of about 10 microtesla RMS, and a DC value, and that's an RF value or the radio frequency value, and then at the static field of 45 microtesla, which is about the Earth's magnetic field around here, you wind up with free radical concentrations, a decrease in O2 minus, an increase of 50% in hydrogen peroxide. So you've got things going in opposite directions, and they're the catalytic reaction of SOD and other things that can modify that. And exactly what the chemistry is going on here, I don't think we understand. But at the same time, we saw a 40-45% increase in cell proliferation rates with exposures to these weak magnetic fields. Now, the temperature changes in here were well less than 1/10 of a degree. So this was not a temperature change problem. So anyway, that's some observations which fit in with the possibility that some of this stuff is modified by radical. There are also stuff that needs to be explored on the effect of electric fields, but that's another story. All right. Now, if we follow up and say, all right, we've observed an increase in hydrogen peroxide, and I've got some other data I could pull up and show you a little later, which is not in this presentation. We find that reactive oxygen hyperreaction, a normal part of the metabolic process. And I'll show you a slide in a moment that shows how much so. It's both a signaling molecule and it's destructive. It can stimulate the growth of cancer at low concentrations. It can lead to killing cancer at high concentrations. So you get both positive and negative effects depending on what you're looking for. And the background on this is that you're normally producing reactive oxygen species modified about 20,000 base pairs per day in a single cell. So we got this going on all the time. And the question is, how often does it cause problems that don't get fixed? It's not, does it not exist? It exists plenty. All right. Now here's a nice indication on what radical concentrations do in slide 16. It shows that during exercise, you may increase your reactive oxygen concentrations by as much as 10 to 15 times. But then when you quit, you relax, you bring it back down to the normal baseline. But the problems occur if you maintain it in an extended way and you reset that baseline. So if you wind up with high concentrations for extended periods of time, that's when you wind up with the thing causing problems. And there's a lot more to learn, and we're beginning to understand a little more about what the time effect of radicals and hydrogen peroxide, which is not a radical. Well, radicals generally have a pretty short lifetime. Okay, so that's one thing. So then the second question which has been raised and talked a little bit about, why don't we
go back to the previous slide, back to slide 16?
Sure.
So what's also here important to note for our listeners, this type of effect also is seen or shown in the climate change framework, which is something called the shifting baseline syndrome, where when you're wanting to study the patterns in the oceans and you want to do an epidemiologic study of how are things back then than they are now, and the thing of what is considered as average, our perception of it has actually changed over time. So they point out in a diagram, the pattern is it needs to go back to this normal baseline. However, when you have a continued dysregulation of chronic stress, that baseline ends up shifting and being elevated and staying at an elevated point for an extended period of time, or it actually becomes a new average and baseline. And that's a difficult thing with trying to study the effects non-native EMF has on a population, because it's very hard to find different populations that don't have the same ubiquitous exposure, or even to look at different age groups, because when they're being chronically exposed to these higher ambient levels, the average level is no longer there. We have this shifting baseline syndrome, which makes the studies a lot more difficult. And hence it's important to go back to these base foundations and actually looking at literature that are decades old to get a more accurate understanding of baseline and where we should be refining the science and the studies.
Well, that's part of the problem, but the other thing is, if you look at just plain electricity, If you look at people that don't have any electricity, you wind up with so many other differences in their living style and background, it's hard to separate out what's cause and what's effect. So you've got too many changes going on simultaneously to make it, well, anyway, you have a lot of changes going on simultaneously, and that makes it difficult to separate out which one's causing the problem. Favorite example that I give in class is it says that correlation is not cause and effect. Sun rises and the cock crows. Cause and effect may go one way, but not the other.
True. Yes, that is correct. And that's why, again, we look at it as a non-linear effect. And, you know, when we're looking at pattern observations, it's not about, I mean, even the thing of physics and sort of more quantum mechanics, it's not about that necessarily that linear cause and effect. It's about understanding or recognizing a pattern that's more important, sort of trying to get a predictability of things. But even then, yet there's no real such thing in that theory that there's a direct cause and effect.
Well, there are cause and effects, but when you've got multiple things going on with different time constants, it becomes hard to unscramble what's driving what.
Yes.
So anyway, that's part of what I want to point out in the next 2 or 3 slides. First is when we generate excess reactions, we also generate additional antioxidants, and there's a time delay to the generation of the antioxidants and the reduction of the hydrogen peroxide. Similarly, if we reverse the process and we wind up changing the concentration of the antioxidants, we wind up with a feedback process that changes the rate at which you're generating the hydrogen peroxide. So this is a loop, and it's a loop with a time delay in its response. Now, there are a lot of biological amplifiers, and most of them are such that they are negative feedback. But there are more than 3,000 signaling proteins, and there are more than 15-second messengers. So there are all kinds of signaling systems going on here, and they operate on timescales anywhere from 10 to the minus 10 seconds to generations, which are years. All right. So you've got all kinds of feedback and time delays to deal with in this. Now, what happens if you apply a periodic signal? The system sign of the gain depends upon the timing of the input you're putting in with respect to the natural period of the system. And the example I show here, rather than electronics, is if you push a swing at the peak, you accelerate it. If you push it in the same direction at the bottom, you stop it. So you're looking at the timing with respect to the natural cycle. You can either wind up with an increase, a decrease, or you wind up pushing in such a direction you don't do anything. So you get all 3 outputs, positive, negative, and no output, depending on your timing of when you apply your external signal. So this has a big effect, and I think one of the most exciting things about the use of magnetic fields and also electromagnetic fields is that it gives us a way of providing a signal, an electromagnetic signal, that's converted to chemistry that the body already knows how to use as a signaling mechanism. So I think, yes, we have a problem of people worrying about hazards, and that's proper. But I think the more exciting possibility is that we may be able, say, either to accelerate the immune system response or inhibit an overreaction. So we got the possibility of providing an electromagnetic signal that the body already knows how to convert to a chemical signal that it already knows how to use. So I think that's where a lot of excitement is to come down the road.
And a key thing also at that is that with having those, pivotal excitements and what's capable of happening is that those are always would be conducted in a controlled environment. However, in today's world, most people now, especially in developed worlds, have about 7 wireless communication devices per person. And that's excluding the domestic magnetic fields of their appliances in their home, their office, and also the blue light effect as well. So this crazy bombardment really puts a lot of chronic stresses, and with the body not having ability to adapt or change even during resting periods. But as you said, the more we understand how to work on tackling these exciting things of how to boost the body's immune system, it highlights more, okay, if this protocol is to be effective, then we need to make these alternate changes to have this improved biological performance of the human being and environment.
Well, the other thing is we need to know under what conditions it doesn't do anything to worry about. In other words, a large part of the time, it's not going to do anything important. And what it would do to you and me today may be very different from what it would do to us tonight, or if you have a stress cold, or if you're a young kid or you're old like I am. These things can all be different. And so the timing, as well as the size of the signal, how it's repeated and so forth, are all likely to make a difference. So there is a great deal to be learned about from and the details on when this is significant, when it's not.
I think also key you mentioned 2 key words here, what happens to a young child or infant versus you as an elderly person. And this also has to deal with the body's own frequency. So, there was a couple with the SAR modeling, and it shows, what is the impact of the body's 100 megahertz interacting with low electromagnetic fields, and also with microwave frequencies in the 1 to 4 gigahertz range. And what they found was that, when a person is below the height of 1.3 meters, I'm not sure what that is in feet, but the whole body SAR absorption is up to 40% that of the adult reference level. So, and that was the same for the magnetic field as well. So it's quite interesting to show that, as a person gets also older, and they not only is their health depreciating, but also a person becomes shorter. And they might also hit that threshold where their whole body absorption of the radiation is amplified due to its own body resonance interacting with the environmental magnetic field.
Well, but those numbers you can calculate with the difference in the virtual family that they've run out of Neil Kuster's group at Zurich, so forth, shows some of those things. But the changes in the biology are probably a lot larger. We have no idea what thresholds are important, for what length of exposures, at what level, and how those things trade off, and so forth. To my knowledge, a large part of what you want to know there has simply not been studied yet. So there are just a whole lot of unknowns. Yeah, calculating the fact that if you're 4 feet high versus 6 feet high, you've got to resonate at a different frequency. That's straightforward electromagnetic theory to calculate that.
In a way,
different size heads are going to resonate at different frequencies and so on. So that's relatively straightforward. But what those fields do and what levels are important, that's a much harder problem.
So in a way, with this sort of bombardment, like we're thinking of children and that, and they're growing in development, and they're having a harder time to adapt to this type of stresses, or their bodies are being more overworked. Isn't that sort of maybe in a stretch in a way to call it a form of child abuse?
It may not be, well, it may be positive. We did some experiments, Elena Kornieva did some experiments with me in St. Petersburg, where she exposed 12 mice to 50 hertz at 21 microtectosol, which is about half the Earth's magnetic field in that area. An hour a day for 5 days, and then gave them a very heavy dose of X-rays. And the mice that had been exposed recovered much more rapidly than the unexposed mice. Okay, so definitely there the exposure was positive. And you can think of it a little bit like if you're training to run a 100-yard dash, the chances are you respond faster and so forth if you get in a race than if you haven't trained at all.
Yeah.
So at this stage of the game, I don't think we can comfortably say that the exposures in some groups are gonna wind up leading to a healthier situation, given, again, part of the epidemiological study, the interphone study. Light users were healthier than expected. Heavy users were in more trouble. So there's a whole lot to unscramble here.
Again, as you said earlier, it comes down to the complexity of biology, and no two persons are the same with their state of their environment, their stress, their mitochondrial development, and so forth.
Yeah, and if you've had some stresses, you wind up responding to a heavy stress better than if you haven't had any stresses before. So these are the whole problem needs a lot of work in order to understand what's really going on.
So that adaptive approach, as you mentioned in the beginning of the slides, where the one guidelines focuses on the thermal effect, it takes on a Procrustean approach where everything is the same and standard, and we don't want to take into account these other potential complexities of people being different or environments being different. And what I understand you saying now, that just leads to trouble and a misunderstanding of the reality of things.
Well, the other thing is you don't know how to take it on. You don't know what, at the low levels, you can't really sometimes tell whether it's helpful or damaging. You simply don't know. So part of it is philosophical in terms of, do you take on and do you let the technology develop and take your chances, or do the risks turn out to be greater than the rewards, or the other way around? You have a very hard time predicting that in advance. And so it's a philosophical problem. And as I said at the beginning, if you want things to be perfectly safe, you're not going to have them.
Yeah. And I guess also there's that inherent potential issue in academia or research of conflict of interest, because, at the end of the day, we have a job and we have to do studies and research. And if we produce data that's not in favor of our funder, then that leads to jeopardization of your ability to maintain your research endeavors or support you and your family. So it's still trying to navigate that potential political crossroad if that does occur. And that's where more understanding the science of what to do is vitally important. And it's challenging. I don't know if you experienced it in your neck of the woods, but it's something that I've found in my research and other research that I've followed.
Well, certainly, in my experience is we go ahead and publish what we get, and the chips fall where they fall. But it also means if you come up with things that people don't like, the chances are you don't get renewed. But that's just the way it goes. And okay, sometimes people are much brighter than that, and you go ahead and unscramble it, because if the cost of not following through and finding out really what's going on can lead to really monstrous type problems later. So it depends on how far-sighted your management is and what it is you find. So I've seen both cases.
Because that's the story that was happened with, like I say, at the beginning where you're involved with the power line studies, and where David Becker got very emotionally involved in the data he saw and was giving information. And when he published his data, his funding was pulled, and it wasn't able to emotionally handle it so well.
Well, in the opposite side of it, Public Service of Colorado, working with my colleague Jack Fuller, who had a lot of their confidence, couldn't have been better about supporting us getting the data that went into the Savage study. They could not have been more helpful. They would make measurements. They would give you the data. It was accurate. They would not tell you what the health effects were because they didn't know and they said so. But they couldn't have been better and more farsighted in the way they treated us on that study. So it goes both ways.
I think that's very important to re-emphasize what you've just been saying, because many members in the audience would get very hung up or caught out on relying on what the media says. And I know from firsthand, media journalists can be really annoying, where they would take one piece of word of an entire paragraph and twist around, manipulate, and a whole different story comes out. And you kind of going, that never happened, or none of this. And they just change things to get more sensationalism. And that only, cripples the scientific research endeavors even further.
Well, I've been there. I spent an hour explaining the power line studies to one of the TV stations. And in the middle of the conversation, where I explained a lot of what we know and what we don't know and so forth, I said, some people say we should bury the power lines, but given the data we have, I don't think it's worth it. And the only quote in the newspaper is Barnes says some people say we should bury the power lines. End of quote.
Yeah, interestingly, with the power line, there was I'm trying to remember the paper, it was 2004, 2013 maybe, on where California State did a mathematical calculation model. And depending on the circumstances, yes, it's cheaper to put the power lines underground. And that was still with folks in the AC system. But now with the going on to the cleaner energy or renewable energy movement, there's this focus on moving on to a DC grid, and where it's much more efficient and cost effective, and actually turns out to be cheaper to put the power lines underground on a DC system.
Yep. No, then, well, DC effects and AC effects have got somewhat different sorts of results. In one sense, radical recombination rates are such that from a radical pair point of view, they basically can't tell whether it's AC or 50 cycles or 60 cycles or DC. But from other things with the induced electric fields, it's quite different, and some of the biology is different. So there are differences, but in some cases and not others.
All right, let's carry on.
Okay. This is some data that Cindy Bingham, one of my students, took back in '96 or so, and we didn't understand a thing. And here's a growth rate of mastocytoma cells as a function of the amplitude of a 60 cycle field. And you can see she can increase the growth rate of these cells by 3.5, 4 times, change the field slightly, and she attenuates the growth rate by more than 50%. When she did that data, we had no clue as to what to even look for. And the paper was rejected. We couldn't answer some of the questions that the reviewer asked. Cindy was tending bar. It would have been months to answer some of the questions that the reviewers asked. And so this data never got published until I put it in this paper and that Ben and I wrote about. But this shows, again, how important the details are. In other words, small changes in the magnetic field here lead to either increases or decreases radically in the growth rate of the cancer cells. When we saw this, it was a surprise. Now, my favorite cartoon on this is that if you just look at the average, on the average, this guy's at the right temperature, right? On the average, those fields weren't doing much. Basically what it says is the average doesn't tell us what we want to know.
And that's a very dangerous thing in algorithmic medicine, because it tends to want to focus on the average. And by doing that, you're not able to direct the research in terms of what actually needs to be evaluated further. So when in the data, you actually want to look for these spikes so you can understand, why were these spikes happening? Why were they causing an improvement or failure to the biological system? So picking up those outliers and evaluating further is highly critical. But when it's shown as average, like you said, it's just overlooked, and it becomes another paper on PubMed or something. And none the wiser, the reader looks at the abstract and ends up being like a journalist, just taking what the word is for versus the details of what the study actually meant?
Well, and when Cindy did that work, we had no idea what was going on at all. So basically 20 years later, when we kind of figured out some possible ways, and certainly if we were to do those experiments today, we'd do them, not only those, but there are other experiments that are closely related to it that would eliminate things a lot more. We'd do them again. But in that case, as usual, I was broke. We didn't have any money. That one came to an end where it came to an end. Okay. Recently, we've shown that we've been working with fibrosarcoma cells. We've shown, as I showed before, you get both increases in growth rate with exposure at 7 megahertz or in the 5 to 10 megahertz region. We're changing the growth rates and increasing hydrogen peroxide and changing the concentration. Okay. Now, this is a study out of India, which showed that people living within 80 meters of a base station wound up with higher levels of reactive oxygen than those living more than 300 meters. And relatively small number of people, 40 people, but the p-value is high, and there are questions about what p-values actually mean. And it appeared that the thing that was causing the changes were a reduction in the antioxidant concentrations. So that's what we're doing. So let's just kind of wrap some of this up. Standards are currently set on short-term exposures to biological effect. Long-term effects can lead to both increases and decreases in the concentration levels of free radicals, reactive oxygen, reactive nitrogen species. These effects will be a function of frequency, the angle between the AC and the DC field, the amplitude and pulse repetition rates. And the biological effects are expected to be a function of time and depend on other stresses and other things going on in the system. So that's kind of to summarize what we're up to. One can look a little farther and say, what are the implications? And if we go back to that interphone study, which was 13 countries, 27 million bucks worth of stuff, and they showed no overall increase in the odds ratio for the incidence of brain tumors observed over 5 to 10 years of exposure. However, for the 10th decile, cumulative exposure based on patients or people being quizzed recall, which can be quite inaccurate, there was an increase of about 1.4 in the incidence for glioma, and just a little bit of an increase in meningioma. Okay. Now, if we look at other studies on odds ratios for heavy or exposures to either RF or low frequencies, typical range of changes are in the range of 1.5 to 2 times the background. And the question is, what does this mean and how does this fit in with what's going on? In the US, it's estimated there are about 8.4 new cases of brain tumors per year. And these are age adjusted and so forth. And if we take for the top 10% and multiply that by a factor of 1.4 out of the internet study, interphone study rather, that brings it up to about 11.8. If we look at traffic fatalities in the United States, it's about 11 per 100,000 per year. If we looked at the overall incidence for the population here, you'd be adding about 1 case per year per 100,000. So this is just putting in some numbers. I'm not vouching for the accuracy of this. It's just an estimate based on one set of data, and there is a whole lot of unknowns to follow it up. All right. One can look at risk factors for various different things, and there are a couple of different tables on this. You know, smoking risk factor 10 to 40 and so forth, and you have to look at these, see what they mean. The one that's more fun, if you look at the power line study, for example, where you say smoking is 10 to 40, the Savage study that I was involved in and the Word Iver Leaper study showed that living close to power lines was 1.5 to 3. So that just kind of put how various different things lead to it. Coffee and bladder cancers is in the same sort of range. And here's the table I think is the most fun. If you look at the number of days of life lost for various things, turns out the biggest ones being an unmarried male, 3,500 days. Being an unmarried female is only 1,600 days. Smoking is, let's see, I got to blow this up so I can read it a little better. Let's see, we got to see this a little better here.
If you go to the bottom right of your screen, you can zoom out a bit if you like.
Okay. This thing switched out on me. Okay, here. Wait a second. Come on. Oh, I don't want this. I don't know how I got here. All right. Anyway, you look at different things, very down cup of coffee, maybe something like 30 to 300 days. Various other things lead to stuff. And it's interesting to see kind of what you get. Come on. This thing's not moving around. Okay, well, anyway, the point is it's interesting to look at the various relative risks. And I think the question is you have to put cell phones into this thing. Where do you stick it? Depends on what kind of user you are, what phone you're using, where you hold it. You hold it in front of you. Are you texting? Are you using it as a phone? What kind of phone is it? More recent phones wind up emitting less power than old ones, and so on. So anyway, there's a long list of things here that you could consider in order to decide what you want to do. Okay, that kind of covers what I had prepared. There's lots of other data and so on. So
I was hoping to get some of your input since you're covering the studies there. Like with the interphone, it focuses on very specific cancers or issues that arise. And again, that becomes a specific narrative, because I don't know if you have any comments about the publications from the NTP study and the Ramazzini study. I mean, for the Ramazzini study, only the first part of the data is being released. There's still the second part where there's this focus on only the few types of cancers, but in the Ramazzini study, I found, well, there was actually a number of other sporadic cancer growths around the body of the subjects. And those need to be taken into account as well on showing the potential biological effects. I don't know if you have any hypotheses or ideas or comments of those two studies.
Well, I sat in on the review of the National Toxicology Study, and I think their data is as carefully taken and analyzed as they know how to do. One of the things that occurred was that in looking at what is the significance of their result, it depended a little bit on how you look at it. And I had a considerable talk with the pathologists that were involved. And the usual way of looking at toxicology is to assume a linear dose response from 0 to high levels. And they were observing things that were not linear. And I pointed out to them some data that we've taken and some data that Wendy Bean's taken. It says, your response to magnetic fields is just flat, not linear. And I showed them some slides to that effect on the growth of planaria, where we changed static magnetic field at 200 microtesla, were inhibiting the growth. At 500 microtesla, they were accelerating the growth. And the result was that I think they took their results to be more significant than they had originally thought. But anyway, I think the National Toxicology Study is as well done as anybody knows how to do today for that kind of study. Is it the study I would propose now? When they started this, I think it was 2004. And the amount of time and money that went into setting that up, I think they did what they could do at that stage of the game. If I was designing a new study today, I would measure some different parameters and try to do some modeling based on some of the things we now know about that we didn't know about then.
I think that's what was very important with the Ramazzini study, because both of them were very similar, but also they did certain assessments differently, and hence sort of they were, from my understanding of the review, there was more comments and interpretation. Dr. Bior, I have trouble with the pronunciation, the Biorgelli, or the pronunciation. In the press conference afterwards, she was commenting, to make some comments on the review of the data. The one being that they themselves are scientists; they're not policymakers, and they've just done the research. They can give the information out there for the public, but it's the public's job to demand or make sure that these adjustments be made to policy, and sort of what new studies need to carry on from there. And the other thing she made was, as a personal review of this research, is that based on the findings, is number one, by all means keep a cell phone away from a child, and particularly from pregnant mothers as well, because of the effects that she was observing from the research and the data. But I don't know, maybe if you'll be able to give some comments on that, or.
Well, I've seen some other data that indicates that there are potential problems with pregnancy. And I've seen other data study on epidemiological data that shows cognitive ability problems at ages 7 to 12 or whatever, or heavy cell phone use from beginning of pregnancy on through and afterwards. As with all these things, you've got to look at the data closely. You've got to look at the way stuff is done, because it's easy to get off track. And there's certainly data out there that's enough to make one pause and say there's things that there are potential problems associated with heavy use of wireless.
I mean, to take it back to home, a key thing is here, again, the name of the show is SuperDads, and you yourself are a dad, and I assume also a grandfather, but you're not only, a parent to yourself, but you're also a dad to your students. You nurture them, you grow them, you educate them, and end of the day, they go off, to have their own children. And I assume you have still connection from students from years ago. But how is, being a researcher in this field impacted your choice in communications with your own children and grandchildren, and how they approach non-native EMFs?
Well, I tell them what I know, and I doubt if it changes what they do very much. And it's quite variable among the students in class, which is a better sample, because I've got 2 grandchildren, and each one of those has got their separate issues. But my feeling is that we do not respond to low-level long-term risks very well. And that's true on a whole lot of topics. Cell phones is only one small piece of this thing. Look at the reaction to climate change that's going on. A lot of people are flat denying its existence. And certainly as far as changing what they're doing. And you've got all kinds of other problems the same way. You look at potentials for earthquakes, for example. How much do people put in really protecting themselves against earthquakes? So rare events that cause big problems that occur at infrequent intervals, usually humans don't treat them very well.
And also we have the issue or incidents from non-native EMFs is that how it affects the brain chemistry, it lowers the dopamine levels in the brain. And the issue when that sort of occurs is that how it makes one sort of dumber is that it removes our ability to think laterally or connecting the dots. And we become horses with blinkers on the side when one has these low dopamine levels. So to communicate, if it's with your children or grandchildren or your students, and they have these low dopamine levels, they're never really going to get the issues of, like you said, of climate change or an earthquake. And we become this thing of only once we experience our own personal failures, then we go, hold on, this has now become a real reality for me. I need to address it and try to tackle it. And it is a tricky thing to navigate. And we don't wish to have these type of failures on oneself, but they are a necessary evil. And so that comes back to, you mentioned earlier about 5G. From my interpretation, with non-native EMFs, with the rollout of 5G, now there's been the highest level of opposition and warnings from persons that were quiet in the past. So more scientists, more doctors, more physicians and all that in the realm are speaking up against and saying, hold on, we're having more of a condition issue here because there's more complaints of association between potential health problems. So we need to reevaluate how we're going to study and take a more precautionary policy on the take of things.
Well, you've got all kinds of problems. You've got people from whom there are no observed effects. You've got people that are hypersensitive. I've had people ask me to turn my computer off because the Wi-Fi in the room. I know I spent a very interesting couple of hours a Saturday afternoon in Cape Town a few years ago with a group of hypersensitive people, and their problems are real. There's no question about that. Cause and effect I can't vouch for, but the fact that they've got real problems is not a question, right? One lady winds up in the emergency room if she goes into a shopping center. Do you turn off all the Wi-Fi in the shopping center for everybody because she should be able to go into that shopping center? I don't know how to answer that question.
And that's why my research, discussing before, I've switched my PhD more of interest towards biophysics now. And because in my original master's thesis, I was to do the modeling of the potential effects and look at mitigation options and redo scenario modeling. But in reality, to do this kind of studies takes a lot of time, and focusing more on these mitigation options of how can one increase their redox potential to actually handle the tolerance levels to the non-native EMFs a lot better is more critically important. So, if the lady who can't go into the shopping center is having too much of a difficulty, it's to look at the science, what can be done to alter her redox potential so that she can have a higher tolerance level to go into that shopping center. And then when she does go home, she has a more protective environment. But that's where policy comes in, is that those residential areas do stay more protected in the exposure levels, because you don't necessarily want to have the same levels as on a military base. It's on high alert for a specific task going on 24/7 in your home backyard. You want to have some civility about where the application is.
Yeah, well, there are multiple ways to deal with this, and they have different results. Incidentally, on your thesis, I had a hard time trying to pull it up. If you've got a PDF copy of it, I'd appreciate it.
Yeah, I'll send it through to you again. I think I did send it by WeTransfer. I don't know if you got it, but I can resend it to you.
Yeah, well, if you could send it to me by a PDF or something, that would be appreciated. Whatever it was, I had trouble opening it, and I didn't really get a chance to read it, and I would like to have.
All right, I'll definitely do that. Otherwise, do you have any final closing of comments or suggestions for our audience?
Well, the research along this line is going to continue to advance. And I think we not only, I think one of the key points I want to make is that we not only have a potential for damage, but we also have the potential for doing positive things. And it's really interesting to try to understand this so that we can use these electric and magnetic fields as a way of signaling the biological systems to do the things we want them to do, as well as worrying about the hazard problem. So I think that's one of the key points is I think there's a real opportunity here for providing medicine with a new tool. And I think that's where a lot of excitement is to come.
And that's vitally important. I mean, one of our previous guests was an attorney, and in South Africa, we have this thing like if for mining and whatnot, you have a policy clause called social responsibility. So if you want to mine the resource in a particular area, the company has to put so much funds aside for building housing or shopping and job creation to mitigate the risks. So at the same time, the same could be applied to non-native EMFs, where social responsibility funding is put towards these mitigation options of how to increase the biological performance of persons in the environment. So that lady who has trouble going to a shopping center, she can be biologically enhanced through these non-native EMFs to actually be able to tolerate these different environments better.
That certainly would be a nice way to make things work out. Anyway, there's a lot of work to do to get from where we are today to where we need to be in order to be able to handle these things properly.
Frank, thank you so much for your time. I know we did take a lot of it and I did interject a lot of questions, but your information research is really paramount and very helpful. And thank you so much for sharing with us and doing all your dedication to your work and your students.
Well, thank you. Enjoyed having a chance to visit with you. And I'll be happy to try to answer questions if people want to send me email if I can.
We will put your contact details in the show notes, and we look forward to probably having you on the show again in the future.
Okay, good enough. Thank you.
For more, visit www.nicheradio.co.za.